Over the past couple of decades, Seattle has quietly built one of the most successful new urban rail systems in the United States. Since its opening, the Link Light Rail system has been progressively expanded, steadily grown its ridership, and perhaps most importantly, managed to maintain political support across repeated ballot measures and waves of construction. Fast forward to today, and despite being less than 2 decades old, the system is literally the second most used light rail system in the US by average weekday riders, ranking above far more established systems like San Francisco's Muni or Boston's Green Line, and only behind Los Angeles, a city with a much bigger population. On top of that, as we shall see in this video, there are some very ambitious plans underway to grow the system, which could see it gain 2 new lines, 37 new stations, and more than double in length. Hi all, I'm City Moose and I make videos about transport and urbanism, so if that sounds interesting to you, consider subscribing to the channel. If you want to support the channel, you can also check out my Ko-fi, it is always greatly appreciated. For most of the 20th century, Seattle followed a fairly typical American transport trajectory. Like many cities, it once had an extensive streetcar network, but most of that was dismantled mid-century in favor of cars, highways, and buses, leaving the city without any sort of urban rail network. And also like many cities, by the late 20th century, congestion was worsening, buses were filling up, and there was growing public resistance to expanding freeways. Seattle's geography only intensified these pressures. The city is surrounded by water and hills, and as such has been built along narrow corridors, which limits how much you can realistically add to the road network. That's when rail re-entered the picture. In 1995, a regional ballot measure proposed building quite an extensive light rail system across the Seattle region. It was a pretty ambitious concept, but perhaps a bit too ambitious as it was ultimately rejected by voters. A little while later, however, a scaled-back approach was once again put to public vote, and this time it passed. This saw the creation of Sound Transit, a centralized transit agency that would manage the public transport services across much of Seattle's metropolitan area, and which had the mandate to establish a commuter rail service, which would be called Sounder, set up a network of express buses, and plan a light rail system. It would be over a decade in 2009 when the first leg of the new light rail system would open, running from SeaTac Airport up to Westlake via downtown Seattle. This initial route was made up of some elevated sections, some street running sections, and even some underground sections, including a tunnel underneath downtown Seattle. This tunnel is one of the more interesting parts of the light rail's story. Called the Downtown Seattle Transit Tunnel, it was originally built for buses so that they could avoid surface congestion in the city centre. Thankfully, however, planners anticipated that this tunnel might one day carry rail, and as such, the structure was built with clearances and geometry that could accommodate trains in the future. This was some pretty great foresight. With this existing tunnel through the densest part of the city, Seattle could avoid much of the expense and disruption that typically comes with digging a new subway, which helped make the light rail relatively quick and cheap to build, which, as we saw with those ballot measures, was ultimately crucial to actually getting the project off the ground. This was important as building complex, particularly tunneled transport lines these days has gotten so expensive. In fact, it just feels like everything has gotten more expensive recently, and especially after all my recent holiday spending, I've personally been trying to get a better handle on where my money is actually going, rather than just vaguely hoping it works out at the end of the month. And this is why I'm really happy to be partnering with today's sponsor, Rocket Money. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you see all of your finances in one place, your accounts, your spending, and especially your subscriptions, without having to constantly jump between different apps or statements. The app will give you a single and clear overview of all of your finances, and I gotta say, before you use this, you don't really realize how much mental overhead you're carrying just keeping track of things in your head. Rocket Money lets you instantly see what's coming in, what's going out, and what's left, which honestly makes planning ahead with your finances feel way less overwhelming. I particularly like how useful it is for managing your various subscriptions. I'm definitely someone who signs up for things with good intentions and then just forgets about them, but because Rocket Money automatically lists them all in one place, you can easily see if there's something not being used anymore, and you can even cancel those subscriptions in the app with just a couple of taps, instead of digging through settings or emails. So if you want to get a clearer picture of your finances and start building better habits going into the new year, you can try Rocket Money for free. Go to rocketmoney.com/citymoose or click the link in the description to get started, and you can even unlock more features if you decide to go premium. Big thanks to Rocket Money for sponsoring today's video, but now let's get back to Seattle's light rail. I've seen a lot of people be a bit negative about light rail as a transport mode recently, many of which with good reason. It doesn't help that we've seen some recent high-profile projects, like Line 6 in Toronto, have some pretty underwhelming launches. The thing with light rail is that it is often chosen as a compromise. It's cheaper than building a full subway, which makes it appealing for cost-sensitive politicians, and very flexible, being able to run along street level, underground, and elevated alignments. But of course it also comes with drawbacks, like lower capacities and slower speeds, especially when running along the street. With that said, I think the system in Seattle is a great example of where that compromise can work. When the system was being built, light rail was flexible enough that it could run along the street for some cheap to build at-grade alignments. It could reuse the existing bus tunnels beneath downtown, while still allowing buses to use them at the same time, which they did until like 2019, and it could easily be placed on elevated structures that needed to make tightish turns to be able to fit alongside the city's road network. Being this flexible also kept the build costs and times relatively low, which was important as earlier more expensive proposals had proven themselves not to be politically viable. Given the system's fast-growing ridership, a full metro would probably ultimately have been the better option transport-wise, but transport planning is, I guess unfortunately, not always about what is the absolute best transport option, and political viability is also just as important. Seattle's starting point was having no urban rail system, so it's not that surprising that there wasn't a political appetite to invest in a full-on subway system. Indeed, we already saw the more expensive 1995 proposal get rejected at the ballot box. While light rail might not be perfect, that low cost and flexibility do mean it's often a politically palatable way to actually get a rail-based transport system built in very car-dominated urban environments, which can make the difference between something actually being built versus nothing at all. Plus, I just think the proof is in the pudding, with Seattle's less than 20-year-old system being, as I mentioned previously, the second most used light railway in the United States, and one whose flexibility has allowed it to be progressively expanded. Since that original line from the airport to Westlake opened in 2009, the system has seen quite a few extensions added to it, and even whole new lines. In 2016, the line was extended up to the University of Washington via a tunnel, followed by another tunnel extension to Northgate in 2021, followed by the most recent northern extension to Linwood, which primarily runs along an elevated alignment next to the I-5 freeway. On the southern end, a small elevated extension to Angel Lake would open in 2016, and then, only in the last few weeks, another, much more substantial southern extension of the line opened to Federal Way, which would mostly follow a grade-separated ground level or elevated alignment, also next to the I-5 freeway. Another recent addition to Seattle's light rail has been a completely new line, called Line 2, which runs from South Bellevue to downtown Redmond, again along a mix of at-grade and grade-separated alignments. At the time I'm making this video, this line is completely separated from Line 1, with passengers needing to use buses to transfer between the two lines. This is going to change, however, in what I think is set to be the biggest addition to Seattle's light rail network since its opening, because ideally sometime this year, a connection between Line 1 and 2 should open, and to say this connection will be kind of unique would be a pretty massive understatement. That's because it will see the light rail cross Lake Washington along a floating bridge, which will make it not just the only light rail system to cross a floating bridge, but the only railway in general. Obviously, this is super cool. The bridge already exists carrying car traffic, but this will see some light rail lanes added to it. The bridge was originally built as a floating bridge to get around the fact that Lake Washington gets pretty deep and has quite a soft lake bed, which would make standard bridge piers a bit impractical. Once this connection is built though, it will set Seattle's light rail system up for a whole heap of changes. Firstly, Line 2 will be able to connect with Line 1 and then share its alignment up to Linwood, which will also allow Line 1 to be pulled back to Westlake, where work is being done to create a new branch to the northwest for it up to Ballard. Line 1 will then also be extended southwards to Tacoma Dome, where it will offer an interchange with the Sounder commuter rail system, as well as Tacoma's own T-Line light railway. There is even potential for a new dedicated downtown tunnel to be added to the network for Line 1, so that it doesn't need to share the existing tunnel with Line 2. This will be especially important as there are plans to add even more lines to the network, including a third line which would run from Alaska Junction in West Seattle to SoDo Stadium, where it will join up with the original Line 1 alignment to run north up to Linwood, before going even further up on a new alignment to Everett, where it will create another interchange with the Sounder commuter rail system. There would even be a potential fourth line in the east that would run from South Kirkland to Issaquah with an interchange for Line 2 along the way, but such a line is only projected to open in the 2040s. Altogether though, these expansions will result in a more than doubling of the size of the city's light rail network and could well see it become the most used light rail system in the United States, which I think is all a pretty great result for a city that, less than 2 decades ago, didn't have any urban rail transport at all. I also think it shows that, while it may not always be perfect, light rail can form an excellent starting point for a city's rail network. Obviously, it offers a ton of flexibility and is cheap to build, but what I think Seattle has also shown us is how a light rail system can easily evolve into what is more of a light metro system at this point. While the network still has some street running segments, these don't hold its speed back all that much thanks to the ample grade-separated sections that make up the majority of the network. Now, I do have some issues with the idea of putting light rail in tunnels, as tunneled light rail is almost as expensive to build as tunneled heavy rail, but in this case, a lot of these tunnels existed before the light rail was built, and the system is just making smart reuse of them. What I do like, however, is all of the elevated sections, as I think these really take advantage of the light rail mode. Building heavy rail metros in complex built-up environments usually means tunneling or lots of forced land acquisitions, as the trains simply can't make the tight corners required to fit alongside existing infrastructure above ground, thus making them very expensive. In contrast, smaller light rail trains, like those used by Link, can make sharper turns, so their elevated tracks can easily weave through existing built-up neighborhoods, allowing these much cheaper, but still grade-separated and thus relatively fast, elevated alignments to be built. While Seattle's rail network still has a very long way to go to be considered up there with the great transit networks of the world, it does show how a very car-dependent city can start to transition to a more transit-focused approach. And given how the network has been able to become one of the most used light rail networks in the US in such a short period of time, and given how it's managed to excite voters to the point where they have approved multiple new lines of it to be constructed, I think it also shows what an important role light rail can play in building public trust in transit as a long-term investment. Overall, I think Seattle's experience suggests that getting something high quality built, expanding it steadily, and letting people see the benefits in their daily lives can be far more powerful than chasing a theoretically perfect system that never survives the ballot box. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you want to support the channel, you can also check out my Ko-fi, it is always greatly appreciated. But with that all said, I'm Kyle, aka City Moose, and as always, thanks for watching.